What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our starts and sits for the tight end position for Week 8 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday Night Football, we've got the Ravens and the Buccaneers. I say we still start Mark Andrews. I know he gave you a goose egg in Week 7, just 2 targets on the day and no receptions. He's technically questionable at this point in the week, but if he does suit up, if he is good to go, I just don't want you guys to lose faith in Mark Andrews. The ceiling that he brings on a weekly basis is far too high for us to consider sitting him. If you have a really good streaming option who you're confident in, you could roll with them, but I really think a majority of fantasy owners who own Mark Andrews need to start him going into this matchup. Now, it is a short week, Thursday Night Football, like I said, so there is a strong possibility that Mark Andrews does not play, so we need to monitor that. In terms of the Buccaneers tight ends, we've got Cade Otton, who I think is a decent streaming option overall, but he's been a little bit inconsistent coming off of a 10.4 fantasy performance in Week 7, 4 receptions for 64 receiving yards. I do think you can consider streaming Cade Otton in a week where we're without Travis Kelce and Gerald Everett. All right, Broncos at Jaguars. I think we got 2 solid streaming options. I don't necessarily want to list either player as a start, but I think that Greg Dulcich is definitely on the rise for the Denver Broncos. Double-digit fantasy performances in both of his starts. Didn't get to play until Week 6 due to injury, but Week 6, 12.4 fantasy points. Week 7, 11.1. 6 receptions, 51 receiving yards. I think that Greggy D could be a really solid play in London, but keep in mind the Jaguars have been pretty good overall against the tight end position. On the other hand, we've got Evan Ingram, who comes in as your tight end 14, facing up against the Denver Broncos, who this defense is definitely for real, but they're kind of middle of the pack against the tight end position. He had 10.7 fantasy points in Week 7 and 67 receiving yards off of 4 receptions. Evan Ingram is just basically a tight end you can plug in on a weekly basis and bet on getting about 10 fantasy points. So I think we can plan on doing so here in Week 8. All right, Dolphins at Lions. Mike Gesicki comes in as your tight end 16 so far in full PPR on the season. I think he's a good streaming option, though. The Lions defense is absolutely awful, and they are not good against the tight end position. So although Mike Gesicki only has 2 double-digit fantasy performances on the season, I do think he is a good option if you don't have better options moving into Week 8. On the other hand, TJ Hawkinson continues to be a weekly play. He is technically questionable at the moment, dealing with a knee injury, so we need to monitor his health, but he comes in as your tight end 5 on the season. I know a lot of ups and downs in terms of Hawkinson's stat lines, but you just can't put away the potential ceiling that Hawkinson brings. So if he's healthy for this matchup, he's a start for me moving into Week 8. All right, Panthers at Falcons. I'm sitting the Panthers tight ends. Truly nothing to waste our time on there. No one to start on the Carolina Panthers teams in terms of the tight end position. Kyle Pitts is a sit for me. I get it. 10.9 fantasy points in Week 6 was really exciting, but I also warned you guys he only had 3 targets and 3 receptions in that game. In Week 7, he finished with 3.9 fantasy points, 5 targets, 3 receptions, and just not a good stat line. 9 receiving yards. Guys, the rate that the Falcons are throwing the football is absolutely awful from a fantasy perspective. There's no reason to consider Kyle Pitts as we're moving into Week 8. All right, Cardinals at Vikings. I say we roll with Zach Ertz. He's coming off of his worst fantasy performance of the season with just 6.1 fantasy points in Week 7 against the Saints. Just 2 receptions off 4 targets, 21 receiving yards. But hey, he's still your tight end 3 in full PPR. So far on the season, we are not sitting Zach Ertz. The Cardinals are one of the worst teams in fantasy football against the tight end position. Irv Smith is coming off of a bye week. He's your tight end 20 in fantasy, only 2 double-digit fantasy performances so far on the year, but this matchup is phenomenal. The Cardinals gave up 2 touchdowns last week to JUWAN Johnson of the New Orleans Saints. I think Irv Smith could finish with a really solid stat line. You can consider him a streaming option if you need a replacement, but overall, Irv Smith is just a solid start as we approach Week 8. All right, Cole Kmet is a sit for me against the Cowboys defense, and on top of that, he is just not playing good from a fantasy perspective. 5.2 fantasy points in week 7, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 32 receiving yards. Nothing to see here for Cole Kmet, and believe it or not, I'm going to sit Dalton Schultz unless you just don't have better options. There's no one else you can pick up. He's still listed as questionable at this point in the week. I know he had a good bounce back in week 7, coming back from injury at 9.9 fantasy points, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 49 receiving yards, but because he's still limited due to the knee issue, and the Bears have played really well against the tight end position so far on the season, I'm going to consider Schultz a sit unless you absolutely do not have a better option moving into week 8. All right, Raiders at Saints. I've got Waller as a sit if he is good to go. He did return to practice on Wednesday, still dealing with a hamstring injury, but the Saints are one of the best teams in the league against opposing tight ends. So with the combination of the matchup and the injury, I'm going to sit Waller. Similar to Schultz, though, if you don't have better options, I think you can take the risk, but I would recommend sitting him over all. On the other hand, Juwan Johnson's a decent stream because the Raiders have been very bad against the tight end position, and he showed up last week, right? A little bit of boomer bust potential there, and the same with Taysom Hill. We don't really know exactly how much he's going to line up at tight end and how much he's not, but he's always worth the option. Still had 10.12 fantasy points in week 7, and a good matchup for Hill and Johnson going up against the Raiders here in week 8. All right, Steelers at Eagles. Pat Freiermuth comes in as your tight end 9 in full PPR so far on the season. It's a tough matchup against the Eagles, but the Steelers should be in a game script here where they need to throw the football, and Freiermuth continues to be just a great security blanket. 9 targets last week against the Miami Dolphins, 8 receptions, 75 receiving yards, 15.5 fantasy points for Freiermuth. He is currently listed as questionable, had a limited practice on Wednesday, but hey, I just think Freiermuth is playing too good of football to sit him right now and brings a lot of value in full PPR scoring formats. Dallas Goedert comes in as your tight end 8, just 1 spot behind Pat Freiermuth, and he gets a much better matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. We're starting all pieces of this Eagles offense right now, and Goedert has been really solid on the year. Only 1 game throughout the first 6 games of the year where he had less than 9 fantasy points. Goedert is a start for me, undoubtedly, moving into week 8. All right, Patriots at Jets. I'm sitting Hunter Henry, just 2.2 fantasy points after some promise in week 6 where he had 16.1 fantasy points. This Patriots offense outside of the run game just does not offer any fantasy value outside of maybe, I guess, Jacoby Myers as well. But Henry, just a very disappointing season. We're not considering him a start as we move in to week 8. Tyler Conklin has really fallen off of the map. Just 6.2 fantasy points in week 7, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 22 receiving yards. The chemistry between Zach Wilson and Conklin is not what it was between Flacco and Conklin. And this Patriots defense, although they played very poorly in Monday Night Football against the Bears, is a good defense. So Conklin is not going to be a start as we approach week 8. All right, Titans at Texans. Nothing to see here. I'm not going to waste your guys' time. We're not considering starting any Titans tight ends or any Texans tight ends. As we move into week 8, we can move right along. The Giants at Seahawks. I am sitting the Giants tight ends. It is a good matchup, but Daniel Bellinger is going to miss this game, dealing with he's going to have to undergo eye surgery after last week getting poked in the eye during the game. So Ellinger would have been a good stream, but he's going to be a sit, even though this is a good matchup against the Seahawks defense. Will Dissly, on the other hand, is a desperate streaming option. We saw some good stat lines earlier in the year, and he's kind of come back to earth, but 8.5 fantasy points in week 7 and a good matchup this week against the Giants defense that's been relatively vulnerable to the tight end position. So if you're absolutely desperate in full PPR leagues, you can consider Dissly moving into week 8. Our Commanders at Colts. We're sitting the Commanders tight ends. Nothing to go over here. No production out of these players, regardless of who the quarterback is. And Logan Thomas is still not on the field, so really nothing to go over here. And in terms of the Colts tight ends, while there's definitely some talent at the position, we just have no consistency. There's no way we can trust one of the 3 tight ends that the Colts are using. Plus, we want to sit back and see, who does Ellinger have chemistry with? Who does he target now that he is the starting quarterback? So we're sitting the Commanders tight ends and the Colts tight ends as we move into week 8. Niners at Rams, I'm starting George Kittle. It's a little bit of a tough matchup, but after the last 2 performances where he's had at least 17 fantasy points, I just don't think we can consider sitting George Kittle. We've seen the production now on the season, and we don't want to limit our rosters from having those potential ceilings. So I like Kittle in this matchup, and I like Tyler Higbee, who only has 1 fantasy performance with less than 8.9 fantasy points in full PPR. So far on the season, I think this could be a good matchup for both tight ends, so they will both be starts for me moving into week 8. All right, Packers at Bills. I'm going to sit Robert Tonyan unless you're absolutely desperate. You can always consider streaming him, but it's a tough matchup against the Bills, and I'm really worried about this Green Bay Packers offense. So bottom line, if you can't find better options out there, you can roll with Robert Tonyan, but I would limit your expectations overall. On the other hand, Dawson Knox is a sit for me. Had his best fantasy performance in week 6 against the Kansas City Chiefs. Had a bye week in week 7, so you can always roll the dice with Knox, but he only has 1 touchdown on the year, and he is 110% touchdown dependent, so I will sit Dawson Knox going into week 8. All right, Bengals at Browns. I'm going to sit Hayden Hurst. I think he's a tight end you can always throw out there and get it close to 10 points, but this is a tough matchup. Believe it or not, the Cleveland Browns have played really well against the tight end position. So if you can't find better options on the waiver, yes, you can play Hayden Hurst, but if you have better options, I think you actually want to avoid this matchup against the Browns. He's going to be touchdown dependent in this game. On the other hand, David Njoku will miss week 8, so Harrison Bryant will be the starter for the Browns. I'm not confident in this start. If Njoku was the starter, I think he would be perfectly fine, of course, but with Harrison Bryant having to roll out for the Browns, we are sitting Bryant. We are sitting the Browns tight ends as we approach week 8. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. And feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.